In a world where it seems totally normal to listen to a podcast about the Toronto Argonauts, it's the X's and Argos podcast.
Welcome to the X's and Argos post-game reaction podcast brought to you by Funny Bone Broth. My name is Ben Grant, joined as always by JB as the Calgary Stampeders take down the Toronto Argonauts 29-2. The score is very misleading. The result is probably not misleading. This never felt like it was going to be a Toronto win. JB, is this one of those games that we just write off, forget about, throw in the garbage, and sort of say, you know, this happens to teams. Sometimes this just happens, and you just got to forget about it, move on? Or is this alarm bells ringing, and you really got to start looking into what the problems are?
Probably somewhere in the middle. I think that it's not as terrible as probably a lot of the people listening or a lot of the people watching feel it was. You can't deny they are 0-4 against the top teams in the West. That's a problem. I don't think you can just write off the fact that they went to Calgary and were unable to really move the ball very well and unable to score. It definitely does identify issues that have to be, dealt with. Calgary is a bad matchup for Toronto. They run basically the same offense. It's not an emergency, but it is concerning.
What I saw today was two very, very similar teams. One had slightly better production from their offensive line. Actually, not slightly. Had much better production from their offensive line. And that was the difference in this one. I thought that the Toronto defense, was outstanding today, especially when you consider all the stars that they lost on their defense, already playing without Jamal Peters, then to lose... And Jamal Peters, the CFL's interception leader, and then to lose Wynton McManus in the first quarter, who is a candidate for Defensive Player of the Year, and then to lose Shane Ray. Actually, Shane Ray went out even before that, early in the first quarter, who is one of the most dangerous players on the Toronto defense. And then, by the time they lost Royce Mechie later in the game, it was almost decided by then. But to lose all those guys and still have the team in it right at the end. They only, going to the fourth quarter, they had only allowed 14 points, and 7 of those were on the offense, turning the ball over deep in their own end. They were amazing today, and I think that's going to get forgotten about because this just all around just feels like you look at the score, with 29 points. It really wasn't like that, though, was it?
No, it was 14-2 until, not I would say deep, but at least into the fourth. And then, they are pushing, they throw a bad pick six, and then the final touchdown was kind of a rub it in your face move by Calgary to, to run up the score for some reason. So, it is, we talk about the kind of the 5-play rule. For sure, if they have 5 plays go a different way, they can win this game. This was not the BC Lion game where they got the doors blown off or they weren't competing. They absolutely competed. If you watch the game, they had some drives that went okay, but then stalled. Calgary didn't really have any success moving the ball. It is disappointing, but you can certainly come up with a way to win this game. If they played again, I think they'd have a decent chance of winning. I don't think this was the mismatch that the score showed.
Not at all. I think in that fourth quarter, there was a moment there. So it's 14-2, and Bethel Thompson launches a deep ball for Deveris Daniels. Deveris was wide open, and it ended up going over the wrong shoulder. And that, if that's a catch, that's a touchdown. And suddenly it's a 14-9 game with like 7 minutes to go. but it ends up not being a catch. And you talking to Bethel Thompson after the game about that throw, it was just a case of them being on slightly different pages. And I think this goes back to DeVaris Daniels typically not being a guy that runs deep routes from inside the slot. Like, he hasn't done a lot of seams, go routes from the inside. And Bethel Thompson was expecting to fade him to the outside, and instead he sort of skinnied in and wasn't able to pick up the ball over his other shoulder. But that little difference there, that was it. And then on the very next drive, there's another bomb that just misses. This one was just thrown a little bit too far. It hits DeVaris Daniels' fingertips, and he couldn't bring it in. But either one of those hits, and we've got a game coming down to the wire. Now, we got out of hand at the end, but games like this do. So I don't know. I think,
yeah, I mean,
ultimately, it's a bad game from the Toronto offense. There's
right.
no question. You can't sugarcoat that.
No,
but
exactly.
It could have been there.
Exactly. Like, I don't want to be just saying, well, that's what happens. Like, no, look, this is a problem. There is a book out on the Argos. The Calgary wrote the book. Calgary then read the book to Toronto. It's disappointing that we weren't prepared for that, because we talked about it in our pod. Like clearly Calgary knew what to do to Toronto. They had just done it. And they came out and did it again. So that I was certainly disappointed by that there didn't seem to be a new game plan for attacking Calgary, because Calgary was all over Toronto today. They just knew everything they were running, and they, that would happen last time. So yeah, I think for sure the takeaway is this is an issue. I don't think the takeaway is Toronto is a fraud. And the West is all powerful, which there might be some places that will make that argument. I don't think that's the argument. I think the argument is we have to fix this. Calgary is a bad matchup with us, and I think a lot rides on that BC Lion game.
I think this, if we were to sum up the issues with the offense, I think they come down to really one thing. And that's every time Toronto found themselves in second and more than 4, which was a number of times, Calgary would rush 3, send 9 into coverage, and those 3 would get home. They would create pressure. They would force a throw, and there was nothing at all downfield. You've got a great view from the McMahon Stadium press box. It's way up there. And I'm looking downfield at 9 guys in coverage, whether they're playing 2-man or whether they're just dropping into the smallest of zones. There's nothing. There's nobody open downfield, and usually the solution to that is that when you're only rushing 3, well, you can hold them off for a while, and eventually someone will break open. But that wasn't happening. They were generating as much pressure from a 3-man rush as teams generally get from a 4 or 5-man rush, except that they've got the added bonus of having those extra guys in coverage downfield. And you just can't win when you're trying to pass into that. It's just there's no answer to that. If you don't have a screen game, a draw game, or a running quarterback, would have changed that a little bit too. But you've got to get yourself in a position where a 3-man rush can't just be the end of your offensive attack.
No, I mean, you can't win. Well, we just saw you can't win. You're exactly right. You cannot win a football game if the defense is able to get home with 3. There's just no. It's like having 3 extra players on your team. You're not going to beat a team that has 3 more guys than you do. And essentially that's what was happening. It was they were playing with more players, and that's why it looked that way. It was like, why are there 3 Calgary guys around every catch? It's like that. Well, that's why. So that, yeah, look, that's an issue, and it is a matchup issue, I think, more than anything else. We talked about the Calgary connection. They know the playbook. They know the route combinations. I don't think necessarily that's what we're going to run into against other teams. For example, the Lions. I don't think the Lions are going to be able to come out and do that. So Yeah, it's disappointing. Of course, you like to see the team come up big against a big opponent, and they just could not get the offense going at all. Um, so that's yeah, that sucks.
Something that I thought was interesting, I spent some time watching specific Calgary DBs just to see what they were doing and how they were shutting things down. They were actually breaking on the ball at the same time as the Argos receiver and sometimes before that, which shows you this film study that we're talking about. Like watching Moxie, for example, there were a couple plays where he seemed to, it was almost like, and I don't think they did know the plays in advance, but it looked like that. It looked like they were in the huddle and broke the huddle,
Yeah, I
lined
mean,
up and ran that route.
The broadcast commented on it. The Calgary is running the routes for Toronto, and they did a bit of that when they were in Toronto, and I think that that's the downside of bringing the Calgary playbook to Toronto. Is it's still the Calgary playbook, and that's tough. That's tough to because they know the fundamentals underlying all of your offense, and you don't have, we've talked about the Argos don't have game breaking speed. That's not how they're built. So, what the scheme is, you can play it pretty well. But I think on the reverse, Toronto was ready for everything Calgary was doing.
Yeah, they were. They were all over Calgary similarly, but they couldn't generate pressure with three.
And we dropped 2 picks. Yeah. I mean, exactly, and we couldn't get pressure with 3. I mean, that's really the difference. Is if you catch one of those interceptions, whether Hoyt or Amos catches one of those interceptions, or you're able to get a little more pressure, it's a different ballgame. I think that's the difference. There's a heavyweight fight between 2 defenses, and they just caught a break that we weren't able to.
Let's talk about a couple of things that we noticed during the game. The first one I want to talk about is we had a very early appearance of Ryan Hunter in this game, the newly signed offensive lineman. They brought him in as a tight end. I think it was in that first series. I think it might have been the second play of the game. They brought him in as a tight end, and I thought I was really excited by that because I just wanted to see how that was going to look. And I think what we saw was why it takes a little time for guys that have been playing American ball to transition to the Canadian side, because he came in and it was a pass play and he's lined up as a tight end, but he has a defensive end outside of him, and the defensive end went flying by him. He didn't even get a hand on him. And this is because it takes time for American linemen. Now, he's Canadian, but I'll get back to that in a second. It takes time for American linemen to adjust to that 1 yard neutral zone. It's really difficult. Your angle is different. Everything that you've been doing for, in some cases, your whole life is now, or your whole football life is now different because of that 1 yard. It really does change a lot. And I know he's Canadian. He's from North Bay, but from high school onwards, he's been playing American football. And at the highest level into the NFL for 4 years, that is going to take some time for him to adjust to. So I'm not surprised that they didn't run that out there a lot, but it was probably good for him to get into a game, probably good for him to see that on film, and he'll be aware of what he has to work on. He's a highly intelligent guy. He'll be all over that as soon as he can. But it shows you why he wasn't starting this week, because I did have some people asking, if he's so smart, he knows the playbook, why isn't he out there? That's why he's not out there yet. He will be, and he'll be great, but not yet. JB, let's talk about some of the injuries. Man, I can't remember another game where Toronto lost this many guys in such short order. It was devastating that first quarter to lose, like we talked about. Peters is already out, to lose McManus, to lose Ray. I did get a little bit of an injury update. They don't know everything yet, but just talking to Coach Dinwiddie after the game, he said that Shane Ray's injury they were suspecting was a torn bicep, and they're going to do some tests and have an answer to that. He was in a sling all night, and it looked like, just the way the guys around the bench were going over to him, arm around him, giving him a hug. I guess it seemed like it looked like this was somebody whose season had ended, the way they were acting on the bench. We don't know anything yet, but it really didn't look good. And then Wynton McManus, I didn't actually see the injury happen, but he was on crutches. He had his knee wrapped, ice on it. What did it look like to you?
Yeah, I mean, basically like bending something around a pole. Like one of those toys you have where you can, take your pencil and wrap it around a metal pole, and it wraps around the pole. That's what it looked like. It looked like it would probably be like a bad knee sprain, because he wasn't collapsed in on, he wasn't rolled up on. He swung around trying to make a tackle, and he smashed into the legs of an offensive lineman, and his knee bent around the offensive lineman. So that would be, having seen it, best to hope that you're looking at, like a two game sprain, MCL sprain. I'd be really surprised if that was a tear. Usually that type of contact doesn't cause a tear.
Coach Dinwiddie was pretty, I guess, optimistic about that as well. Maybe thinking that this, I think I'm trying to remember his exact words because I don't want to misquote him at all, but I believe he said he suspected it was an MCL issue, and in hoping he's coming back this season. Obviously that means that they're hoping that this is not a tear, but obviously they'll do tests, and hopefully it is just something that has him out for a few weeks. And I don't even mind if he sits for the rest of the regular season. Maybe that's what's best for him. But to have him back for the playoffs will be huge, because you saw the difference in what was happening when Wynton McManus came out of the game. They put Trevor Hoyt in, and Trevor Hoyt, I love Trevor Hoyt as a player. I think he's fantastic, but Wynton McManus is the best will linebacker in the league. And there's a huge drop off after that, no matter who you are. And the other thing was they were kind of having to rotate situationally, because McManus can do multiple things. McManus is a great run stopper, but he's also great in coverage. And what the Argos were doing instead is basically on 1st and 10, they were leaving in Hoyt as the will backer. And then on 2nd down, they'd replace Hoyt with Priester and sort of play the 7 DB look, which Calgary started running on. But when they were passing on it, that was a vulnerability when Hoyt was in the game, because Hoyt's coverage isn't as good as Priester's coverage. So it really put them in a bind. And then as they started to lose more and more players, they couldn't even really keep up with that anymore. So that was sort of when the wheels started falling off. But yeah, it's a massive thing to be without Wynton McManus for these next few games is going to be extremely tough on the defense. Yeah,
especially against BC. That is, I mean, Mwamba looked fantastic today. That's going to be, it's going to be a lot to ask of the defense to try and hold up against BC without him. But you're going to need to. Montreal is probably going to run their next 2 games, and it's going to come down to those final 2 games in the East.
Are you worried about the run defense? Because I know some of those yards were late, but the one really good drive that Calgary had early was their 2nd touchdown. So that first touchdown was basically gifted to them. Bethel Thompson threw an interception in Toronto's end. It was at like the 23-yard line, and Calgary converted. But their 2nd touchdown was a real drive, and it was a lot of Kadeem Carey. He ended the night 14 carries for 92 yards. That's 6.6 average. And Peyton Logan was averaging 7 yards a carry with seven carries for 49 yards. These are scary rushing numbers, and Toronto's run defense has been decent this year. Does that worry you, seeing a good running team like this, knowing that Montreal has got Stanback, who is going to run a lot like we saw from Carey? That's going to be their game plan.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to say no. I think if you look, they put a little more into the run, but I wouldn't say that the game plan was stop the run. I think the game plan was still stop the pass. They still held them to 14 points for 3 quarters. That should be enough to win. So They did have a nice drive there, I agree, but it was only the one good drive. So, I know they went for like whatever 140 as a team, but I don't think the inability to stop the run what was the primary problem. I think it's okay. I don't think the run matters in the CFL. To be honest with you, I don't think it matters. Like they went for 140 and a touchdown, but who cares? They easily could have lost that game with all those running stats intact. It did not. It didn't tilt the game.
Yeah, I'm with you on that as well. And I'm okay in that bend but don't break philosophy, allowing teams to run, because in 3-down football, it just takes one stop. And now suddenly, well, I guess that's the end of that drive. And passing wise, they did hold Jake Maier to pretty limited numbers. His percentage was high, but it was a lot of underneath stuff. 17 for 24 for 175, a touchdown and 2 interceptions. Like those aren't numbers that you're happy with. And he had a better day than Bethel Thompson, mind you. Bethel Thompson was completing just 50%, 19 of 38, which is really not good for 194 and 2 picks. It was a weird combination because, first of all, no one was open, but when guys were open, Bethel Thompson wasn't hitting them. He missed a couple of deep balls. There was the 2 to Daniels that I talked about. There was another one to Gittins Jr. There was one to Coxie when he had a step. And then there were a couple of shorter passes that he usually does hit where he just couldn't quite find his guy. It wasn't a good game. It was probably, I think it probably was his worst game of the season. And it didn't help that it was on a day when receivers also couldn't get open and they were behind and so weren't really able to commit that much to the run game. But something that Bethel Thompson said after the game that I thought was interesting, I asked him the question that I asked you is, do you just kind of throw this in the garbage and move on? He said no. He's like, I think there is some really good film from this. I think we're going to learn a lot from this game. But he also talked about some positives. He talked about wanting to go back and take a look at the running game because there were some real positives within that. AJ Ouellette, 9 carries, 66 yards. That's nice. 7.3 yards per carry. That's a really good number. And if you can find a way those are the kinds of numbers that if the game is closer down the stretch, that's fantastic. And so there is maybe something there. Now, is that just Calgary saying, well, we don't care, you can run all day, just kind of like what you're saying, where the run doesn't matter?
I think that's what they played. I think they were fine. They were fine with the let running, and I agree, he did play well, but it didn't move the needle. The pressure on the quarterback all day was not good. Even on the picks, he has thrown worse interceptions. These were under pressure. And when you're under pressure, you're going to make bad throws. So I think it was more a team offense issue that Calgary just knew what they were going to do all game, and they didn't have anything that surprised Calgary. And when you don't surprise the defense, you are dead.
You know what was also really upsetting was that Toronto had a real opportunity defensively had Shane Ray stayed in had he been able to play, had he not been injured, because Calgary was coming into this game, they hadn't allowed a sack in forever. Their offensive line, Calgary's offensive line is really strong, but Derek Dennis was injured last week. He's out for the season, their left tackle. And so he was replaced today by Josh Coker, who actually looked okay early on. He may have given up that first sack. I'm not positive about that, so I don't really want to put it on him with Robbie Smith. But then he was injured and was out for the whole second half. And so they had to replace him with Bryce Bell, who was their backup center. And so now you've got a backup center playing left tackle, and that is normally Shane Ray's spot. Shane Ray would have had a field day back there, and it's just one of those unlucky things. The day that Shane Ray gets injured could have been the day where this is multiple sacks we're talking about, because it would have been a huge mismatch, but no such luck for the Argos, and it just seemed like that was what was happening today. It's just, again, I just feel like it was one of those days. Even like Coach Dinwiddie at the end, we've seen him pretty angry after games when things have gone badly. We've seen him get heated in press conferences and, be clearly upset, visibly upset with the team or how things went. I didn't get that from him today at all. It didn't feel the same way. I didn't feel the frustration from him, and I actually think maybe there are some positives in this. This is a Toronto team that clinched a playoff spot last week, and he commented on that too. He said, we clinched a playoff spot last week, and guys have to realize that you can't just stop. It doesn't just end now, because there's more work to be done. So maybe this is the kick in the pants that the Argos may have needed for this last stretch down the rest of the season.
I mean, from a coach perspective, it felt like a game where you were right there and you had a shot and you missed a deep pass, and that's it. And then that window closed, and then the thing kind of unraveled at the end. And it's really just as simple as that.
I want to go through the drive chart here, because this, I don't know the last time I saw something like this, because the Argos haven't scored 2 points or less in quite a while. Well, it's 2019, but that was such a terrible team. They lost 26-0 to the Edmontons in July of 2019. And, that was the last time there was this sort of output. But look at the drive chart. They had 16 drives in today's game. They went as follows: punt, 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 single, which is a mistake. You don't want a punt single. That's something going poorly. Yes, you got a single point, but a 75-yard punt, that you want that to hold up, obviously. So where are we here? Punt, 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 single, interception, missed field goal, punt, 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 interception for a pick six, turnover on downs, interception. Those are your 16 drives.
Yes, I think where we are suggesting people should not overreact. Also, it was terrible, terrible game planning, terrible execution, terrible offensive football that has to be rectified. That can't be lost. That has to get fixed if they want to have a chance to win the title. You can't have an offense that can be shut down so completely. That is a deeply flawed machine, because Calgary's defense are fine, but they're not this is not an all-time defense. So I do think you're looking at some conventions that maybe if you play Calgary again in the final, you're going to need a whole new playbook. You're going to have to find some things that you didn't bring out of your Calgary kind of underlying beliefs.
I think the stat that shows you how well both defenses played today is the two punters combined for 1,006 punting yards. Think about that in a game. That's unbelievable. Haggerty had 11 punts for 540 yards, and Cody Grace had 9 punts for 466 yards. That is an absurd amount of punting.
You cannot... Well, I mean, I think it's very similar to the first Calgary game, where the defense really played well, and the offense just brought nothing, and that's disappointing. But maybe they didn't have the time between the two games to invent a new offense.
Well, because that can't be the strategy, though. Like, I know if we're talking about Grey Cup, and if it's a Calgary-Toronto Grey Cup, obviously, you don't have a choice there. The odds are it's not going to be Calgary. If Toronto gets the Grey Cup, the odds are that they're certainly not the favorites. You would expect it would be Winnipeg, but if that happens, they will have to address this and maybe make some changes. But it's really hard. You don't want to throw away the base of your system. It doesn't really work like that, where you just say, well, all those plays we've been running all year and all last year, we're not going to use any of those concepts anymore. We're only doing new things. You just don't have the time to perfect that, to build chemistry. It's not a realistic model. And the thing is, when you see it in college sports or in the NFL, there's so many more teams that it rarely comes back to haunt you. Although that said, it happened to my Cincinnati Bengals last year in the Super Bowl, where Zach Taylor, the head coach and offensive coordinator for the Bengals, his entire playbook is based on Sean McVay's playbook. And who does he meet in the Super Bowl? The one guy whose playbook he's using is the guy that he plays in the Super Bowl. It's far more likely to happen in the CFL with only 9 teams. So it is something they need to be aware of, but I'm just not sure there's much you can do about that. I don't think this is the kind of thing where you're just like, well, let's just do all new stuff. I think what you do is you run a lot more. I think your play calls have to change situationally. So second and long, I think you run more. If they're only going to send 3 and guys are bailing way the heck out, let's run some draws. Let's run some screens. They were leaving Ouellette in to block sometimes. One of the most depressing moments of the game was a 3-man rush where the Argos left Ouellette in and Bethel Thompson still got sacked. So you had 6 guys blocking 3 and they got a sack on that play. And so if you're going to leave them in sometimes anyway, then run screens off that, run delayed draws off that, leak outs, things that we really didn't see much of today. And so I think that's more the adjustment you make, not changing the playbook and starting from scratch every time you play Calgary. Do you take anything out of Chad Kelly's time at the end? Because again, Twitter has turned into Twitter again. All of the replace McLeod Bethel Thompson nonsense that we were hearing throughout the early part and middle of the season returned tonight. People saying, should Chad Kelly start next game, etc. Obviously, we know the answer is no. That's ridiculous. That's foolish. What did you get from Chad Kelly's performance, as brief as it was?
Yeah, I mean, he looked like a guy who couldn't, just saw color everywhere and would take the ball and run. I think it just looked like that. He looked like a quarterback who came in and was overwhelmed by what he looked at, which is exactly what should happen as a rookie quarterback. And at no point did he seem like someone who was ready to take over the offense.
It was interesting to me that Calgary called a timeout as soon as he came onto the field. So they saw him out there in the huddle and they called a timeout. I don't know if something else was going on or they needed to make a substitution. I couldn't see anything like that. But then they did play Chad a little differently than they'd been playing Bethel Thompson, but they were still dropping a tremendous number of guys into coverage. But they weren't 3-man rushing the same way, and they were spying him because, of course, he can run. So that is a little bit of a different setup. And I think that makes it tougher for Chad Kelly too, because he comes in the game and the offense that he's been watching Bethel Thompson run, the defense that he's been watching Bethel Thompson run against all game suddenly isn't the same defense that he's seen. And it was tougher for him because even his rushes, he had three runs for 12 yards. You would think there'd be all sorts of space. The way that Calgary's defense was playing Bethel Thompson, if Bethel Thompson had Chad Kelly's speed, there was all sorts of room for him to run around in. However, they're not going to play Chad Kelly that way. It was still enough to not leave much for him. Chad Kelly ends up 1 for 5 for 7 yards and a pick. But the running really wasn't there for him either. And so I think I'm glad he got in the game. I think that was the right call. I asked Coach Dinwiddie if he thought about maybe putting him in earlier or not. And he said no. It was still too tight a game at that point until they scored that pick 6. It was still a game. And he's like, no, I'm not going to put him in that scenario, which I think is correct. Some positives to think about as we start to wrap things up here. I think Eric Rogers coming back is very much needed. I feel like he could have been a difference maker out there today because he's one of those guys who, even in tight coverage, can make plays. He's a big body. He's a very good route runner. He's got great hands. And even when he is blanketed, you can still throw him the ball, and there's a pretty good chance he's going to come down with it. And it allows Deveris Daniels to go back to the outside. And we already talked about that miss today. That miss is the way that Deveris Daniels ran that go route was the way that, that he might run it on the outside and not, the way he'd run it from the slot. So Deveris maybe goes back outside. There's Eric Rogers as your W. And then you've got all sorts of flexibility on the other side. And I don't know how bad DeMonte Coxey's injury is. I'm hoping that he's okay. I didn't see him come back into the game after he was helped to the sideline. So I don't know what to make of that. But I didn't see any other receivers injured in the day. So hopefully if he can come back and they're able to rotate that sort of group of 4 on the field side of Ambles, Phillips, Gittins Jr., and Banks, then I think that's something that gives you some possibilities. So that could really have changed things tonight. And I think, maybe if they do run into Calgary again, the presence of Eric Rogers might be enough to sort of shift the balance a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I thought defensively they held up really well with all those guys out. They still had Calgary in check. Calgary was held to 2 touchdowns. They scored the pick 6, which the defense can't do anything about. And then, at the end of the game was already over. So that last touchdown was just a nothing time touchdown. So I think the fact that the defense didn't come apart is really impressive.
Well, that will just about do it for us on this episode of the X's and Argos podcast. After a wonderful September, October gets off to a pretty horrible start with this 29-2 loss. But we'll see how the team rebounds next week, and we'll obviously be there for it.
Could have a for all the marbles Montreal-Toronto finale.
It's looking like that. It is looking like those last 2 games of the season are really going to determine who wins the East. So we'll see.
Yeah, I love it.
We'll see a couple of big games coming up though. BC, Edmonton, those are going to be pretty important ones too. For JB, this is Ben Grant saying so long, and may all your pre-snap reads be good ones. I'll see you.
Go Toronto Argos, go, go, go. Pull together, fight the foe.